Greetings and welcome to episode 2 of Gender Matters with me, Elizabeth Hobson, Director of Communications, and Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. Apologies for the delay in bringing this second episode to you. I've been struggling with technical issues that may not be entirely resolved, but we're crossing our fingers for a conversation as technically fault-free as it is sure to be fascinating. I'm very excited to introduce our guest. He was a new name to Mike and I when we were contacted regarding his new book, Me After Me Too, Feminism, Patriarchy, Toxic Masculinity and Sundry Cultural Delights, which proved to be an excellent read. Toby Young said of the book that it could not be more timely, and it's a very readable, well-humoured and well-researched analysis of where we are with gender politics that both Mike and I recommend very highly. My copy is full of penciled brackets and folded corners because I know I'll be returning to it over and again. But the pleasant surprises didn't end there for me. Our guest is Professor Emeritus at University College Dublin, where he taught philosophy. He is a Fellow of Mises UK and an Associated Scholar of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama, a member of the Free Speech Union and of the Heterodox Academy. He's published extensively on many issues, from anarchist arguments against the necessity of the state to complex explorations on the legal status of abortion, to defense of free speech and indictment of feminism. I'm looking forward to a most stimulating conversation, so welcome, Professor Gerard Casey.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. You're very kind to say those things of me. If I believe them, I would be swollen in my own esteem. Unfortunately, I know myself only too well.
Oh, thank you, Gerard.
Not at all.
So we have several questions. Mike will present his first, and then I'll present mine.
All right, very good.
Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Gerard, I'd like to echo Elizabeth's sentiments. I too loved the book, including the laugh out loud lines, not something I'd expect in a book by a philosophy professor about feminism and its consequences. I sense that you really enjoyed yourself. I could almost hear you laughing, writing some of those sentences.
You can hear me laughing now.
Now, I've been studying gender issues and feminism full time for over 10 years. And I can't recall a philosophy professor publicly and hilariously challenging feminism and feminists before your book. It long ago became clear to me that every feminist narrative is one or more of the following 5 things: a baseless conspiracy theory, a fantasy, a lie, a delusion, or a myth. Feminists have been corrupting academia along with everything else across the West for over 50 years, and their malign influence increases with each passing year. Can you take us through what you know about academics challenging feminism as an ideology and their challenging of feminist philosophers in particular?
Well, Mike, that's a very easy question to answer. I don't think I know anyone. That could be because I've been dilatory in my research and haven't turned up all of the vast numbers of people philosophers who've been attacking this, or perhaps more likely, given the current state of academia, the fact that there aren't any, and so on. I think the reason for that is perhaps twofold. One, the gatekeepers on the publication journals who would probably tend not to publish that kind of material. And secondly, most men, and it would be men who would probably write this for the most part, would simply don't want the grief and agony that would come from this, and the exclusion and the hostility and all of the other nasty things that would happen to you if you don't toe the party line on this. I was actually quite lucky in my academic career in that I really didn't encounter much, I don't know quite what the word is, not so much opposition, but much hostility until my last 2 to 3 years, just shortly before I retired. But, you know, if I had been a young academic looking for tenure or promotion, I think I could have been justified in keeping my head down, okay, and not inviting the rancor and the hostility of the feminist brigade. So I think that partly at least explains why you won't find a lot of academics generally, and certainly people in philosophy.
Right, and those 2 or 3 years, Gerard, was that when you were starting to criticize and challenge feminism?
No, not really. It's too long a story to go into here. It really was a changing of the guard, and sort of in the department in which I worked, the school in which I worked, and the breaking, as it were, of the, dare I say, the gentleman's agreement we had among the members of staff to keep our views off the kind of common area. And suddenly this poster went up one day without any consultation with anybody, and it said, like, where are the women? And I go, well, where did this come from? And I say, well, lots of them. Well, first of all, they're up on the poster, right? But what's the point of this? And I argued that this was implicitly suggestive of some kind of bias on the part of the. This is particularly ironic, by the way, since I was one of only 2 heads of school who had actually ever hired a full-time female person into the department and so on. So I objected to this, and then because of my objection to this, the rumor started. I was a misogynist and anti-female and all of the rest of the stuff, which is just nonsense. I had more female students than anybody else if it came to that, for that matter. But so it became, and then the things developed from there, and it became very, very nasty and uncomfortable. And I was actually very glad to reach the age of retirement when I could leave and just devote myself to writing,
right.
Which is great.
But it must be hugely demoralizing, particularly for younger academics who, I mean, what's the point of being an academic if you can't actually speak the truth as you see it?
Well, if you want, academics, this is going to sound incredibly cynical, but academics admire 2 things more than anything else. And one of them is in truth. Okay. They admire power and they admire money. Okay. And you give them one or the other and they go weak at the knees. Okay. So I'm afraid, so for example, when Henry VIII wanted somebody to go to bat for him against the Pope, he found an academic to do it. Okay. Right. And that's how it works. Okay. And nothing has changed in the last 400 years when it comes to that. So most academics are career driven, and they're not particularly brave. There's an old joke in Ireland, I'm not sure what it would be like in England, which says that at a meeting of a bishop's conference, a shiver ran around the room looking for a spine to run up. Okay, so you could possibly take any meeting of an academic council anywhere with academics, and the shiver would still be looking for a spine to run up.
That's good.
They're not noted for their valor and their bravery by and large.
Okay. Thanks, John. Okay, that brings me on to my second question. I was very interested to read comments in your book relating to merit in various fields of intellectual pursuit. In intellectual pursuits, as with physical pursuits, where merit can be determined objectively, women are rare or absent at the top levels. One thinks of chess, which you touch on in your book very interestingly, Nobel Prizes in the physical sciences, and so many more fields. It's only where merit is judged subjectively that women make a significant appearance, usually because feminists have corrupted the judging process. And I assume that judging merit of philosophers is somewhat subjective. In your book, you cite an article in 2018 by Camilla Turner, the education editor of the Daily Telegraph, about Oxford University's plans to feminize its philosophy reading lists to appeal more to women. Ms. Turner refers to Elizabeth Anscombe, a philosopher who died in 2001, as one of the greatest philosophers in the post-war period. And you comment with this: while I have a great respect for Anscombe's work, I find the claim that she was one of the greatest philosophers of the post-war period to be, how shall I put it, hyperbolic. End of your comments. Which leads me to my question. What has been the impact on the philosophy profession of pretending that female philosophers are better than they actually are, which to my mind is just one of countless examples of people pandering to female narcissism?
I mean, that's an interesting question. Look, my standards for being great in any field, whether it's music, composition, art, are probably very high. I think the top table in all these areas has exceedingly limited capacity. So, for example, I mean, if we move away from philosophy for a moment and maybe go back to something I point out in the book. So, for example, who are the great composers, right? They're obviously Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and and so on and others. And you might have a larger or smaller list, but I would not have more than maybe 10 or 15. So, for example, take something like Mendelssohn, a composer I love, whose work I admire tremendously and so on. He's either not in the top table for me, or he's just on the borderline. Right? So then they say, well, what about all of these neglected women composers? And I say, well, what about all of the neglected male composers who outnumber the neglected women composers by probably a factor of 100? I'm a great music lover, as you might suspect. So when I was writing the book, I took my copy of the abridged Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians off the shelf, and I randomly, put my finger on 8 or 9 composers, all of whom had written extensively, and whose work is never heard, right, by anybody. One of the joys of being retired now is that I put on a Swiss radio classic, and I let it run during the day. And very often they play composers I've never heard of. I've been an active listener and practitioner in classical music for 60 years, right? So, for example, one of the composers I kind of quote unquote discovered in my retirement was a Swedish composer called Franz Berwald, who would be probably the only one who is not already at the top table, whom I would suggest might conceivably make it there, right? So to come back to your question, the thing is that, so by and large, when it comes to any activity, whether it's mathematics or science and so on, in order to get to the top and be there, you have to be at the top, 0.00000%. And at that end of the spectrum, you're almost always dealing with men. It's not that women can't be good and can't be very good, right? That's true, but the exceptional and outstanding, by and large, no. I mean, I don't like, take contemporary philosophers. Among contemporary philosophers, if I was to identify a woman philosopher whom I admire greatly, it would be Susan Hawke, who's at the University of Miami. Okay, outstanding. And but is she great? No, I don't think so. Is she up there with Wittgenstein or with Eyre or Russell? And the answer is no, I don't think so. Okay, am I up there? Certainly not. I don't even make the second rank in my estimation. Okay, so that's how it works. And this kind of pretends that somehow you can make, as if there's a kind of committee out there which can award greatness by some kind of decree or on a quota basis. It's nonsensical, right?
Sorry, Jerry, but that of course is exactly what's happening. I know at the proms, they have a sort of minimum number of female composers and so on. And the BBC is just unlistenable as far as I'm concerned, unwatchable these days. But to what, I mean, I guess this begs the $64,000 question, Gerard. What is the cause of that greatness?
Oh, well, who knows? I mean, I can't really tell. I mean, we could get into complicated explanations which might be biogenetic and so on, but a lot of it simply has to do with application, dedication, single-mindedness. Sometimes amounting almost to a kind of autism, okay? So that everything else sort of fades away. And most women, I think, and this is to their benefit, are not sort of in the same way kind of autistic. They tend to be, to realize that there's more to life than these things. So you really have to be dedicated to them in a sort of strange way to get to the top. And as Jordan Peterson has pointed out in some of his videos, I'm sure your listeners have been looking at it. So he says, look. Take the woman who excels now in school and in university, in part at least because of the feminization of the educational process, but nonetheless with merit, and then gets a law degree and then starts in practice and is working away and gets to the age of 30, 31 and is now in line for a partnership of some kind, and is working 60, 65, 70, 75 hours a week, and suddenly asks herself, what am I doing? What is the point of this? This is it. Now, by the way, a lot of men probably find themselves in the same situation, but they don't by and large have the luxury of not being able to do it. But a woman is thinking, am I going to be doing this for the next 20 years? I mean, do I take my, will my contracts come to my birthday party? Okay, will my colleagues, hold me and hug me when I'm 50 and 55? And they suddenly realize there's more to life. And at that stage, they tend to make a lot of decisions. Very often it's to have children, whether with or without a partner. And then you get the inevitable career breaks. And of course, I mean, unless you're doing a job like sweeping the floor, where it's not really all that skillful and people who sweep the floor are interchangeable. If you're in a high pressure job where you have responsibilities and so on, if you step out for a number of years, you lose seniority, you lose experience, you lose your contracts, you cannot carry on projects, you cannot simply walk in and pick up where you left off. And so it's not surprising then that women in that situation, if they've made, as I would see them, sensible decisions to see that there's more to life than simply jobs, find themselves in a situation where they are, if you like, behind the curve. But trying to make up for that by imposing restrictions and quotas and all of the rest, simply gives rise, I think, to a suspicion on the part of those who are into the benefit of those kind of procedures that all women, if you like, are, as it were, jumping the queue. And this, of course, is manifestly unfair, okay, and unjust to the women, for example, who have got where they have by hard work and application and skill and talent. So it does it. We saw this, you see the same thing, for example, in all forms of affirmative action, okay, whether it's in terms of race or gender or whatever it might be. So that's always a problem. And, so somebody is, for example, you would find in America, somebody would say, oh, she's a diversity hire, or he's a diversity hire. I mean, that's so degrading. Suppose I am one of that group or one of that identifiable group, and I've, worked my rear end off to get where I am, okay, and done all the hard work and met all the objective criteria. And suddenly now my progress is regarded with suspicion because people think I'm in that group, and I can't go around with a big thing on my chest saying, I'm not a diversity or I'm not a diversity promotion. So it actually poisons the wells and increases suspicion and doesn't improve relations between co-workers.
No, I totally agree, Gerard. But of course, it creates employment for armies of otherwise unemployable women, in sort of diversity, consult, all this sort of, I mean, they are literally, I think, unemployable otherwise. They would be better off, the world would be better off if they were flipping burgers, quite frankly.
In my book's app, okay, chapter 5 is called Diversion, Inclusion and Equality, which of course makes up a very nice acronym, DIE.
yeah.
Okay.
We have, I don't know about Ireland, Gerard, but in the UK we have an appalling scheme called Athena Swan.
We have it here.
Do you? Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, departments are being denied access to research grants if they don't, have tick certain boxes and so on. So basically, male academics are losing out when the female academics with less merit are just jumping ahead of them in the queue.
Yeah, and that's really conducive to good relations, don't you think?
Well, but you hear very little of academics. Oh, I don't want to go back to question one, but no. But there's also perhaps the issue, and I guess it depends on the field. And I totally accept what you say on work ethic and applications, especially I think on something like chess, but also just on IQ. I mean, the male and female bell curves on IQ. Genius is very rarely found. Well, it's not often found in men, obviously, but the proportion of men at the very highest IQ level, it's almost, I think you know this, Elizabeth, don't you? It's almost all men at the very top of the IQ spectrum.
Yeah, and it's almost all men at the bottom as well.
Indeed.
It turns out we very rarely hear about that one. Okay, so women. So in other words, if you were to draw a bell curve for men, you'd have a flat end at the idiot end, and then it goes up, and then it comes down, and then a fairly flat end at the other. And then women tend to start in and go up more. So you get many more women at the median than you do in these things than you do.
Yeah.
And that's just a fact. I mean, this is one of these things. Unless Okay, is this some kind of is this some kind of biological injustice? Well, no. I mean, it's just one of these things. I mean, there are compensating factors. For example, women live longer than men. Okay, so unless you're prepared to remedy that injustice by executing women when they reach the age of 75, I don't know what we're supposed to do about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Gerard. Elizabeth, over to you.
I found your chapter, Gerard, a fate worse than death.
Yeah.
In After Me Too to be particularly brave. There is an interesting passage wherein you describe two coherent positions to take on the question of anonymity in sexual offence trials.
Yes.
That it either be for the accused and the accuser, or neither. I entirely agree, but I'm not 100% sure, and it is a question that I struggle with, which I think would be for the best. And you don't actually make it clear which side of the fence you sit on in the book, so I'd like to explore that.
Yes.
The way I see it, sex offences do come with a particular stigma for the accused and for victims from certain communities, which suggests that anonymity would be prudent. On the other hand, I feel that legislating anonymity for either actually serves to entrench the stigma, and that if societies would just be sensible and reasonable and not rush to judgment in these very unclear cases, then not having anonymity for anyone involved could actually be a better way to move forward. So, what do you really think on that?
Well, yes, I mean, I appreciate your point, but remember, if wishes were horses, then beggars would fly. If the problem is that this whole area is conducive to particularly virulent forms of irrationality, okay? And until such time as that disappears and people learn to suspend judgment, right? Rather than simply assuming that if somebody is accused of a crime, they're thereby guilty, then my preferred position would be anonymity for both. Right, but in the scheme of things, in the fullness of time, okay, if we reach that happy stage where the population at large were to, if you like, accept that the mere accusation by itself isn't equivalent to guilt, then yes, obviously it could join all of the other criminal offences where people are named. Maybe I could take an instance which is currently in the news. I mean, earlier this week, Cardinal Pell was acquitted in Australia by a seminal decision of the Australian High Court. Now, I've been following, I've met Cardinal Pell, and I was impressed by him when I met him. And I was astonished when he was accused of this crime, because while clearly there have been some, indeed many, too many, Catholic priests and prelates who've been involved in ways that are despicable in this area, he didn't strike me antecedently as somebody who was. And when I followed the case, I have some legal training, and when I followed the case, it struck me that the evidence against him didn't really sustain the bringing of a case. I was astonished when he was convicted by a jury trial. I was even more astonished when he went to appeal, and on the 2-1 decision, his appeal was turned down. And so I witnessed with relief the 7-0 acquittal. Now here, it's quite clear that the main broadcasting agency in Australia ran a campaign against him. The Victoria Police behaved in a way that I can only regard as extraordinary. Basically, saying like, roll up, come and lay your claim, as it were, inviting possible claimants to come. And then the Director of Public Prosecutions again brought this to trial. It would seem to me in a way that was simply not in keeping with the basic standards you would think of evidence, which would, which any Director of Public Prosecution, or the CPS in the UK would establish as being, likely to achieve a result. Now, the interesting thing for me is that when he was acquitted, the Premier of Victoria tweeted the following. And he said, "I make no comment on this decision, but I say to those who have been abused, I hear you, I see you, I believe you, which is truly an extraordinary thing to say. And it was, again, I thought to myself, perhaps uncharitably, you know, Premier, if somebody were to come up and say, 30 years ago, you abused me, there are no witnesses, there's no corroborating evidence, would you be saying to this person, I hear you, I see you, I believe you? And therefore, in the current environment, we see, for example, so in the UK, there was a case 2 years ago in Northern Ireland, where these two rugby players were accused of rape, and there was a big case. Now, their names were in the paper for over a year. Their pictures were on television. Every time they went into court, they were seen, and so on. And they were acquitted. They and the two others were acquitted. And I have in a section in the book, I've said innocent but guilty, okay? Because when they were acquitted, they lost their jobs. They were fired. They weren't able to. They had to pay their own expenses. They weren't able to recover their legal costs. Okay, and so, you know, they even though they've been found not guilty, but that's to say innocent, because it's the state's job to prove guilt, they were still guilty and are still deemed to be guilty in the eyes of the public, who are being fed this diet all the time. And so that this is a long-winded way of answering your question. But so to come back to it, yes, in an environment in which people were rational, where they didn't rush to judgment, yes, names of everybody out there, both and so on. I don't see why the complainant's name should be protected when the accused name is not, right? But in the immediate context, I think the only way to do it is the way we do it actually here in the Republic of Ireland, which is the no names for any.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right, actually. And what you mentioned about the Victoria Police and their roll up, where are all the other victims kind of thing, you know, it's exactly what went on with Operation U-Tree here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And not only did they do that, and I think that there are a lot of motivations for people to make false allegations, you know, including attention and
money
sympathy and all these kind of, well, that was what I was going to get onto. You know, they're actually offered compensation, not even flimsy evidence, it's literally no evidence.
Yeah, when
so
when
given those circumstances, yes.
Sorry, Elizabeth, you're breaking up a bit, but I think we'll press on. We're getting sort of most of what you're saying.
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
Let's press on.
So moving on, I found your paper, The Legal Status of the Unborn Child, very interesting. I had no idea that in ancient Rome, fathers had the power of life or death over their children. Yeah. A barbarism well consigned to the dustbin of history.
I think so.
You talk about the born alive rule, wherein a baby's personhood is not recognized until they're born alive. We're both libertarians, you and I I do agree with Ron Paul that the only consistent position for a libertarian subscribing to the non-aggression principle, which I believe you call the zero aggression principle, is to support the right to life of the unborn child. So do you think that our civilization will ever consign the barbarism of giving mothers the power of life or death over their unborn children to the dustbin of history?
Well, in the short term, no. In the long term, who can say? Maybe I can go back to the born alive rule, because I came across this when I was studying for my LLB in London. And then I went on to write about it later on. It's in essence, it's an evidentiary rule, because clearly, if you are to be charged with the death of another human being, you have to be able to establish that you were actually the cause of the death of that human being. Okay, there has to be a causal connection. And of course, in the state of rudimentary embryology, for example, if I struck a woman who was pregnant, and then her child was delivered and was born dead, you cannot tell for definite that my blow was actually the cause of the death of the child. And therefore, while I can be charged obviously with assault on the woman, I cannot be charged with a form of homicide in the child. Now, clearly, if I were to stab, this is a bit gruesome, so apologies to your audience, if I were to stab a woman with a knife in the abdomen and the child were born alive, but suffering from a stab wound from which the child subsequently died, then I could, because there the evidence, if you like, is clear, right? So this was the situation. But of course, we're no longer in this situation in regard to the embryology. We have scanning equipment, and of course, we know a whole lot more about biology than we did before. So the situation, the problem for a libertarian like me, I'm a little bit conflicted on this, which is that pregnancy is common. It's we're all born, all our mothers were pregnant at some stage. There's nothing uncommon about it, but in a way, it's the only situation that occurs naturally in the world where one human being is biologically dependent on the other. Now, obviously, when children are born, they're dependent on their parents for food and so on, but they're not biologically dependent. So this doesn't occur naturally in any other case. And so the question then is, what is the situation and so on? Do you have an obligation to, in other words, we'll say, let's, for example, take it for granted that we're dealing with another entity, okay, which is a human being, clearly, okay. It's not like a boy or a cyst, although I'll come back to that a little later. And if you do, then the question is, what are you dealing with here and from when? And the only answer I think that makes sensible. That is sensible is to say you're dealing with a human being at all stages, very small, obviously a human being with potential, not a potential human being, and therefore any deliberate termination of the life of this small human being is in fact a form of homicide. Whether it's culpable or not is another matter, right? And you have to determine that. So we worryingly, okay, so even the 1967 Act, and I can remember being actually on an After Dark program in 1997 on Channel 4, right, which you can look up in the archives and you'll see, where they're talking about the 30th anniversary of the Abortion Act. And technically, abortion is illegal, but is defensible under certain circumstances. So you have to go through all of the rigmarole of getting people to sign off. We have not, so in a way, we all know that was hypocrisy. Right? And so on. There was never any difficulty in getting people to sign off these things. All you had to say was it's a threat to my mental health, right? But
well, I mean, I believe you never really had to even say that. I did see a documentary a while ago, and there was a stack of papers on a nurse's desk, yeah. And they were the sort of forms that a doctor had pre-signed, yeah. And just said, fill in the name, and whoever wants an abortion can have one.
That's right.
So yeah, yes, I mean, I know when the act was brought in, there was concern that it would lead to abortion on demand, which is exactly what happened.
No, indeed. I mean, but the point is that I accept that indeed that was the reality, at least in some cases, if not necessarily in all. But at least in name, it was still a criminal offense. There are now jurisdictions where it has been decriminalized completely. In other words, they're no longer going through the rigmarole of signing these papers. So in New Zealand, for example, and indeed just recently in Northern Ireland. So it's no longer a criminal offense. It's simply regarded as a medical procedure. So that having an abortion is much like having a boil removed or, having a hysterectomy or something like that. It's something that affects only and concerns only the individual. And that's really a worrying development as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, for those of a certain age, we will remember we'll be familiar with the mantra: safe, legal, and rare. That's what abortion is supposed to be. Well, it might be, and it still is legal, and now more legal than ever. But it hasn't been rare for a long time. I mean, I don't know that any other society has sacrificed so many of its young to whatever gods it is that they worship in the way that we do. It's quite staggering. And it's, of course, safe. Well, safe for whom? The question is certainly not safe for those who are killed in the process. If there's to be a change, the cynic in me says that what will bring this about will not be an appreciation of the moral problem here, but actually an appreciation of the staggering demographic effects which are facing us as our population declines. And as we move from a situation, you remember our social security services are built on the idea that we had a wide base of workers supporting a small group of dependents on top. But of course, over the years, what's happened is that it's become a rectangle like this. And now we're looking at an inverted pyramid. Okay. And indeed, we know from the actuary studies that there is no way that the benefit system that we had, that you have in the UK or we have in Ireland or that they have in the USA, can possibly be supported by the number of young workers we have. So either you have mass emigration, okay, and you use these people, if you like, to pay the taxes to support the aged and the retired and those on benefits, or you have effectively a revolution of some kind when workers start to say, young people start to say, I don't know why I'm paying these enormous taxes, when there's not only no guarantee, but every likelihood that when I reach the stage, there won't be anything there for me. So I suspect that, they say, in novels, they say, cherchez la femme, look for the woman. I always say, cherchez l'argent, look for the money. Okay, and I suspect that the demographic cliff that we're falling over is more likely to bring about a change in policy here. Not the best of reasons for it, that to be said, but nonetheless, if we were to bring about an improvement in the situation, it would be welcome.
I've got to say, just
indeed.
Sorry, Elizabeth, I just want to make one point there. I was in a pub in Dublin, what was it, a year or two ago, when the abortion referendum results came through. That was a very depressing moment for me. I got to say, it was. I think it was widely anticipated. But when I was a young man, the idea that the Irish people might have voted for such a thing, you'd have been laughed out of the room. It was just a very, very sad day.
Yes. Well, what can I say? I mean, I went on the March for Life in Washington in 1983. Okay, 10 years after Roe v. Wade. I actually met the alleged rape victim and so on, who afterwards confessed, of course, that she never had been and so on, and became a pro-life activist. Yeah, but there we are. It was indeed a very sad day and quite extraordinary. Nobody could have possibly foreseen the seismic changes that have taken place in this country in the last 30 years. Right? It's quite staggering. To somebody of my generation, it's actually quite sad. And
this genocide, because that's what it is, we can very squarely lay at the door of feminists. I mean, in the UK alone, 10 million in the last 53 years. Yeah, so probably worldwide, probably hundreds of millions of corpses. These unborn died at the behest of this bloody ideology, this evil ideology.
It's quite staggering. I mean, if you look at, say, human sacrifice in, say, Central and South America, and we're horrified by it and so on. But another country, if you look in the early books of the Bible, there are clearly relics of some kind of human sacrifice going on there, and we eventually get the idea this is not a good idea. Okay, so Abraham has his hand stopped, okay, by God to say, don't do this. And if you were to say, would you think it'd be a good idea if we took, 100,000 of our young people aged 5 to 6 and just kill them and so on? Even though people, the feminists, would be horrified by this. At least I hope they would. And yet, nobody's. When you point out, what's going on here, you're accused of, dramatization or whatever, and it's extraordinary. I mean, this is a scale of human sacrifice that's never been witnessed before in human history. No. And I think, and I hope, and this is to answer Elizabeth's question, I think, and I do hope that in the future, 50, 100, 150, 200 years, people talking on whether then, whatever they've got for communication, will be looking back and with wonder and horror at what went on and saying, how could they possibly have done those things or thought those things? In the same way now that we look back at the apologists, say, for slavery in the United States in the first part of the 19th century. And we wonder how people there could, in good conscience, have supported an institution of that kind. We find it difficult to understand how they could possibly, and yet they did.
Indeed. Yeah. But it is a manifestation of a loss of moral compass, isn't it? I mean, I've been an atheist for 45 years, since I was a teenager. I know you're a practicing Catholic. I was brought up a Catholic,
Yeah.
But it's very clear to me that one result of the loss of religion, of Christianity, has been the loss of the moral compasses. It's as clear to me as anything.
Yeah, well, I was an atheist I wasn't an atheist for 45 years. I managed it merely for about, 15 years. Okay, so you've got 30 years on me, Mike, okay? But in fact, for me, curiously enough, part of what occasioned my return, it wasn't the only factor, it's much too long to go into now, maybe some other time in another video, was that I found myself, even as a non-believer, developing a healthy respect for the Catholic Church's position on life and sex. I didn't find it particularly comfortable or desirable, I have to say, but nonetheless, I thought, well, they may be wrong on some of the issues, but it does seem to be coherent and it does seem to hang together. And sort of grudgingly, I had to accord it my respect, and it was one factor that entered into my eventual return to the church. And that's not to say, by the way, that there aren't plenty of other Christians and indeed Jews and non-believers, for that matter, who reach the same conclusion for a vastly different reason. But yeah, it is a loss. I mean, if I can kind of take a broader perspective on that question, what we've seen over the last 60 years, since the 1960s, I really put it down to the whole sexual revolution. So you've seen the loss of restraints, reticence in matters. There's advertisements on television now, which I just find horrifying. They're just so vulgar. I can't believe that I'm seeing people, talking about these things. I mean, there are human functions, but we didn't talk about these things in public. Okay, it was a matter of reticence. So we've moved from this, let's say, so look, let's take something like divorce, right? So from the 16th century up until the 19th century in the UK, the only way you could get a divorce was by Act of Parliament, right? And it was regarded as disgraceful, socially disgraceful. Roughly for another 100 years, it was still regarded as more or less disgraceful, but of course became more common. You couldn't go into the Queen's box at Ascot if you were divorced. Did you know that?
No.
Okay. Now, the irony of that, of course, won't escape you when a substantial number of her children are divorced, and one of them just married a divorcee. In fact, two of them have married divorcees, right? And so we see this long, slow. I mean, it wasn't a sudden collapse, but slow, and then suddenly it picks up pace. You take something then like contraception, which is prohibited by law and then accepted by the Church of England in 1920, and then only for people in married couple, and then only in restricted circumstances, and then we move in, and then and then suddenly the floodgates open, and it's for everybody in all circumstances. You take abortion. Abortion was regarded with revulsion and horror. Nobody who had one, whether for whatever reason and however much you might defend it in some particular way, would admit to it and so on. Certainly nobody would be found making a case for it, right? And so when it first came on the scene, it was again that mantra of safe, legal and rare, only in exceptional circumstances. The bleeding heart cases of rape victims and incest and others who would die from it and so on, who make up 0.005% of the cases. These are all brought in, and then gradually all of the restrictions are lifted. They're now felt to be onerous, and then we've now seen it's become decriminalized completely. And similarly with sexual relations, so we've gone from a situation where I was watching the 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth this afternoon with my wife, and of course there's a climatic scene where Lydia, the youngest, elopes with Wickham, right? And then it's discovered that they haven't gone to Gretna Green. In fact, they're living together in London, and wait for it, shock horror, they're not married. Now, this makes no sense to modern viewers. They're just wondering, what's the big fuss, right? Whereas you have to have some historical knowledge to go back in time to figure out just how shocking this was. But even to somebody of my generation, I'm not that young, but I'm not that old either, this would have been shocking, right? But now it's not an issue, right? therefore the whole family, the family structure, the idea that marriage is, or sorry, that the best environment to bring up children is in marriage, where with partners of different sexes who are committed to each other and are prepared to and have the ability to pay for the upbringing of the children, and that this is the norm, even though there are obviously circumstances where it can't be had. You're regarded as somehow old-fashioned and a freak if you suggest this is the case. So all of these factors come from the 1960s. And in fact, if you believe the sociologist Patriarchy Sorokin, who was the founder of the sociology department in Harvard, he was Russian and an Orthodox Christian, he actually wrote a book in the 1950s. This is incredible. This will be in my next book, called The American Sex Revolution. And by the way, the 1950s was the Ozzie and Harriet era in the United States, when it was the post-war idyllic scene, where all families, in which people now look back to, as the halcyon days when everything was fine before and he said even then, this is amazing, he said even then, the roots of the breakdown that was coming, were there. I wonder what he would say if he were living now. He would be absolutely astonished. But, full marks to him for his prescience. Amazing stuff.
Yeah. Elizabeth, did you have one final question?
Well, my final question is really linked to what we've been talking about, which was just that I was thinking, about the contemporary feminist denigration of motherhood and fatherhood. And I was wondering whether you think that it would be possible for traditional religious values to restore the importance of these roles.
Well, the answer is yes. But the thing is, if we had religious values, but of course, it's not only motherhood and fatherhood that are being denigrated. Of course, religious values are in decline as well. Okay, so in a sense, if we had those, I mean, again, I don't want to be misunderstood. Of course, we have people who are supposed to be religious and religious practitioners and who don't behave appropriately. It's called sinning. Okay, welcome to the club. But nonetheless, the problem there is we've seen the spectacular decline in religious values. I was amused and horrified simultaneously when I think it was about 2 months ago, Church of England bishops came out with a statement affirming the idea that marriage was for people of different sexes and so on. And they were greeted with outcries of horror, including a letter signed by 2,000 members of the clergy of the Church of England. I was thinking, what's happening here? This is insane. This is insane, but it's what's happening. Right? I mean, it was a very timid and restrained statement. They weren't banging any drums. They were more or less apologetic. And all they got for their pains was to be shouted at by the progressives and the liberals in their own church. And I thought, well, if that's how things are, if you're like in the institution, you would expect above all others to be conservative. What can you expect from society at large?
Indeed.
And I think that's a very good note to end on, I think, Gerard.
Very good.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been fascinating to hear your views on all these subjects. And we wish, we hope we have huge sales of this. It deserves to be an international bestseller. Excellent.
I'm planning to retire to the Bahamas on the strength of the royalties. Yeah.
Gerard, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's been lovely to talk to you. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you.